Harlan Briggs had been dead for 3 years by the time his son walked into the Calhoun County Co-op and told Bill Vester he'd be needing a flatbed trailer for about 6 weeks. Bill Vester said sure and wrote it on a slip of paper and didn't ask what for. He found out later, the way things travel in Calhoun County, Missouri, somebody tells somebody, and it gets to you eventually, usually with the good parts still attached. What Roy Briggs had done was buy 500 bales of textile waste from a closed mill in the next county over. He had paid $900 for all of them. He had no truck capable of moving them. He had no storage plan. He had a notebook his father had left him that nobody else had seen, a leased flatbed from Bill Vester, and an idea that most of the men at the co-op, if they had known about it, would have called generous with the word idea. That was the spring of 2017. By the fall of 2018, Roy Briggs had a waiting list of 61 names and a side business that had cleared $38,000 in its second year. His father never saw any of it. But Harlan Briggs was the one who won that day. Same as always. The stories like this one don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Calhoun County sits in west central Missouri in the kind of country that doesn't photograph well, flat in some places, gently rolling in others, the sort of land that looks ordinary until you've farmed it long enough to know what ordinary is hiding. The county seat is Gallatin, not the one in Tennessee. The one with a grain elevator and a courthouse built in 1909 that has been the same color of limestone gray since before anyone currently living can remember. In 2017, the county had a population of around 8,400, 2 implement dealers, one of which was struggling, one of which was not, and a sale barn that ran cattle every other Saturday and drew buyers from 4 counties. Pearl's dinner opened at 5 in the morning for the farmers who needed coffee before the price boards updated, and closed at 2 in the afternoon when Pearl Haney decided she'd had enough for one day. Pearl had been running the place since 1988 and had at various times employed most of the women in a 4-block radius. The coffee was not good coffee. Nobody went for the coffee. They went because it was warm, and the booths were deep, and the counter faced the window, and you could see who was driving past and in what direction, and draw certain conclusions. On the 3rd Friday of most months, Roy Briggs was there at 5:30, with a cup of that coffee and the back half of the Kansas City Star, in a booth by the window, wearing a canvas Carhartt jacket with a tear in the left elbow that he'd been meaning to patch since 2014. He was not a man who talked a great deal at Pearl's. He listened, mostly, in the way that farmers who have been paying attention for a long time learn to listen, not at the conversation directly, but alongside it, catching the things people say in the space between what they mean to say. 3 or 4 mornings a year he heard something at Pearl's that he wrote down later. That is not a large percentage. It was enough. Roy Briggs was 44 years old in the spring of 2017. He ran a cow-calf operation on 280 acres of leased and owned ground southeast of Gallatin, a mix of Angus and Angus cross cows that he calved out in February and March and sold as weaned calves in the fall to a stocker operation in southwestern Iowa. He had 11 Hereford cows that had belonged to his father and that he kept because his father had kept them. The operation made money in most years. Not a great deal. Enough to make the land payment and put something aside and fix the things that needed fixing, usually in the order they broke. His father, Harlan Briggs, had farmed the same ground for 31 years before a stroke took him in the winter of 2014. Harlan had not been a talkative man. He had been, as Roy once described him to a man at the sale barn, a man who thought more than he said and wrote down more than he thought. The notebook Roy inherited was proof of that. A composition book with a black and white marbly cover, soft at the corners, from years of being put in and taken out of a coat pocket. Filled front to back, and then sideways in the margins with Harlan's handwriting in pencil. Not a diary. More like a running argument Harlan Briggs was having with the world about what things were worth. The entries went back to 1983. They were organized loosely by subject. A cluster about drainage tile and what it did to per acre value over 15 years. A long series about the 1980 farm crisis and which neighbors had sold and for how much and whether in Harlan's judgment they'd made the right call. Entries about equipment maintenance, about cattle genetics, about one bad crop year, and the math of what it actually cost when you counted your own labor at a fair rate. And there were entries, a long series of them in the middle third of the book, about material. Harlan Briggs, before he farmed, had worked for 4 years on the baling line of a feed sack mill in Chillicothe. This was the mid-1960s, before the industry shifted from cotton sacking to paper and then to plastic. Feed sacks in that era were woven cotton, printed cloth, sturdy, often patterned with flowers or small geometric shapes, the kind that farm women sewed into dresses and curtain panels and quilt tops, because you did not waste something with use still in it. The baling line was where the scrap went, the misruns, the off-color lots, the material that had come out wrong in some way the buyer had specified it shouldn't. Some of it went out as salvage, most of it went into the burn pit. Harlan watched good material go into the burn pit for 4 years. It bothered him in a specific way, not as an injustice, exactly, but as an error. A failure of seeing, a decision made upstream by someone who had decided what the material was without checking what it could be. He wrote about it. The notebook entry was dated March of 1991, which is 26 years before any of this mattered. Every mill I ever knew burned or buried what it couldn't sell. What it couldn't sell was not nothing. It was only not what the buyer wanted that particular day. The man who figures out who the buyer is between the mill and the customer will not go broke. He wrote it, and as far as Roy could tell from the rest of the notebook, did nothing with it. Not because he forgot it. Harlan Briggs did not forget things he had written down. Roy believes, and he has said this carefully, once, to his wife, that his father wrote it down because he had not yet figured out which part was his to do. He was recording the idea until the right situation arrived for it. The situation arrived after Harlan was gone. Roy found it on the third read-through of the notebook, in January of 2017, on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. And he sat with it for a long time before he got up. He had heard about the Bales from Gerald Fitch. Gerald ran a salvage operation out of a sheet metal building on the edge of Boonville, and Roy had bought fence post scrap from him twice. Gerald had mentioned the Boonkeller mill, not a paper mill exactly, he said, more of a finishing operation for industrial fiberboard and cardboard sleeve material, had closed in October and left several hundred bales of off-spec production on the backlot. Gerald said he wasn't interested. Too soft, he said, meaning the margins. Roy hadn't said anything at the time. He drove the 40 minutes to Boonville the following Saturday. The bales were stacked on a concrete apron behind the Boonkeller building, which was padlocked, and had a for-lease sign on the front that had been there long enough to fade at the edges. Most of the bales were still in good industrial plastic wrap. At the north end, where a tarp had slipped over the winter, about 30 bales had weathered across the top. Roy walked the rows. He counted twice, lost track both times somewhere past 400, and came out at 497 on the second pass. He decided to call it 500. He spent the better part of an hour on that concrete apron in the cold. February cold in Boone County, Missouri, is not the worst cold in the world, but it is a working cold, the kind that gets into your hands if you're not moving. Roy was moving. He pulled the plastic back on 11 bales across different parts of the 3 rows, 1 from the south end, 2 from the middle, 4 from different positions in the center section, 2 from the weathered north cluster, and put his hands into each one. He worked slowly and did not hurry the assessment. He pressed the material between his fingers at different angles. He folded a corner back on one of the facing stock bales and held it up to read the edge, the way you read a board to check for twist. He smelled it. Not a romantic detail, it is the first thing you do with salvage material to know whether moisture has set into the interior. Because wet fiber has a specific smell that dry fiber doesn't, and you can detect it before you can see it. He is not a man who explains easily what he was looking for. He said later that he was looking for what his father would have called the difference between spoiled and passed over. Spoiled is what cannot be used. Passed over is what someone didn't want, which is a different thing entirely. Marcus Webb, who owned the property adjacent to the Boone Keller lot and who was trying to get a small engine started on a piece of equipment near his back fence, watched the whole process without meaning to. He watched Roy crouch. He watched him stand. He watched him move down the rows with the methodical patience of a man who was not trying to be done quickly. Marcus Webb did not know Roy Briggs and did not speak to him that day. He mentioned it later to someone who mentioned it to someone else, the way things travel. He said the man looked like he was grading something. What he found was not one thing. It never is, with a mill's surplus. There was a heavy fiberboard facing material, the kind used in the interior walls of shipping cartons. Dense, consistent, dry in all but the weathered bales. There was a thinner cardboard sleeve material, lighter weight, the kind used for wrapping industrial rolls and large format printing stock. Some bales of what appeared to be off-spec corrugated liner, rejected because it had come out too heavy for the application it was manufactured to meet, but structurally intact and dry. 2 bale types he could not identify by feel alone. He photographed those and came home and made calls. Phil Danner picked up on the second ring. Phil ran a small box-making operation in Sedalia, and he and Roy had a loose acquaintance built on 2 transactions and an understanding that Roy didn't waste Phil's time. Roy described what he'd seen. Phil said, "The heavy facing material, if it's what you're describing, I can take it." He said, "How much do you have?" Roy said he wasn't certain yet. Phil said, "Call me when you know." Roy made 3 more calls that week. A packaging supply dealer in Columbia. A man who ran a small cold storage insulation business out of Howard County, who Bill Vester had mentioned once. And Lynn Schreiber, who owned a furniture restoration shop in Marshall and who Roy had never met, but whose name he'd gotten from a woman at the co-op who said Lynn was always looking for material. Lynn Schreiber picked up, listened to 2 sentences of description, and said, "What are you asking per bale?" Roy had the number from Phil Danner's interest and from 30 minutes on the phone with an industrial materials broker in St. Joseph who told him what the facing stock was selling for on the secondary market that month. He told Lynn a number. She said, "That works." He had not yet bought the bales. The negotiation with the Boone Keller property manager took 2 meetings and 8 days. Roy had done what his father's notebook called due diligence, and what Roy simply called checking. He had confirmed the property had transferred to the mill's parent company in Columbus, Ohio. He had confirmed the company had received 1 haul quote, $7,400, for clearing the concrete apron, and had declined it as too expensive for a property generating no revenue. He made his offer in the second meeting, $900 for removal rights, all 500 bales, 90-day window, the company relieved of all clearing liability. The property manager, a woman named Karen Solt, who managed 31 properties across 4 states and had no strong feelings about bales of fiberboard sitting in Missouri, said she'd need to confirm with her supervisor. She called back 4 days later and said yes. Roy picked up Bill Vester's flatbed on a Monday morning. He had arranged for Cody Westfall, his neighbor's son, 22, who owned a Ford F-350 capable of pulling the load, to do the hauling at $16 an hour. He had arranged 2 empty equipment bays at the co-op for temporary storage. He had told almost nobody any of this. The first load went to Phil Danner in Sedalia that Thursday. Phil had sent a list of what he could use. Roy had matched it to the bale inventory in the composition notebook he was now using to track the operation, and Cody made the run while Roy sorted the remaining bales by type on the co-op floor. Phil paid $2,800 for that first load. That covered Roy's acquisition cost 3 times over and left him holding the remaining bales at effectively no cost. He posted a single notice that Sunday on a Facebook group for farm supply and material trading in central Missouri. He listed 3 material types. He described them plainly. He said pickup only and named a price per bale. He used no capital letters and no exclamation marks, which is how he wrote most things. He had 16 messages by Friday. A man in Howard County, a retired contractor named Dale Puckett, who had turned a machine shed into a side business making cold storage panels, took 40 bales over 2 trips and called Roy a 3rd time, asking if there was more where that came from. There wasn't, not yet. But Roy wrote his name in the notebook anyway. The woman in Carrollton who ran a small packaging operation out of another converted shed, Roy never did get her last name. Only Carol from Carrollton, which is how she appeared in the ledger, bought the cardboard sleeve stock in 3 lots across 6 weeks. Lynn Schreiber in Marshall, the furniture restoration woman, came herself with a pickup and a small trailer and loaded 8 bales of the facing stock and said she'd be back. She was. What Roy had not anticipated was the pattern of the calls. People who called once called again. People who heard from the people who called told someone else who called. By the end of that first summer, he had sold $19,400 in material, cleared all but 60 bales, and had 14 names asking to be notified when new stock arrived. He called it a waiting list, which made it sound more formal than it was. It was a column in the composition notebook. Names, phone numbers, what they wanted, how much. He used the pencil his father had left in the notebook's spine. He does not know why he kept using that particular pencil. He just felt like he ought to. The second year, he sourced from 3 other operations. A corrugated packaging plant in Chillicothe that was downsizing and had a periodic off-spec problem and no good answer for it. A box manufacturer in Clinton, whose floor manager Roy had met at the Gallatin sale barn, who mentioned over coffee at Pearl's that they disposed of more material than Roy would believe. A paper product converter in Warrensburg, who had been paying a hauler $600 a month to clear surplus stock, and who, once Roy explained what he was doing, offered to call Roy before calling the hauler. By the fall of 2018, the waiting list was 61 names, and the business had cleared $38,000 net for the year. Roy registered it formally that fall as Briggs Material Recovery, which his wife Janet said was a functional name. Roy said that was the intention. She also said he should have a website. He said he'd think about it. He thought about it for about 8 months, and then his daughter helped him put one up, which was 2 pages and a phone number, which is all it needed to be. Phil Danner, the box maker in Sedalia, who had been Roy's first call and first buyer, sent 3 other small manufacturers his direction over the course of that second year. People Phil knew, who had the same material access problem Roy was now in the business of solving. One of them was a corrugated container shop in Warrensburg whose operations manager, a woman named Terry Hobhouse, became Roy's steadiest account for the next 2 years. She called quarterly. She knew what she wanted. She paid on receipt. The co-op Bales served as storage for about 14 months before Roy rented a used pole barn on a county road 3 miles from his farm, which he insulated himself over a long November weekend with help from Cody Westfall. The lease ran $4,800 a year. It was the operation's largest fixed cost, and it was manageable. Roy is 51 now. He still cabs out in February and March and sells in the fall. The 11 Hereford cows his father kept are getting old, and some of them are past their useful years, and Roy keeps them anyway, for the same reason Harlan did, which is not a reason that translates easily into words, but is a real reason. The notebook is in the kitchen drawer next to the flashlight and a half-used roll of electrical tape. The 1991 entry has a check mark next to it in a different pencil. Roy's, made sometime in the fall of 2018, when he sat down to add up the year's numbers and understood, finally, which part had been his to do. He doesn't remember making the mark. He found it one morning and knew he had made it, and didn't need to remember exactly when. Harlan Briggs used to say that most people walk past value every day because they've decided ahead of time what value looks like. He didn't say it often. He wasn't a man who said things often. But when he did say it, he meant it the way farmers mean most things, not as a piece of advice. More as a fact about the world that had taken him something to learn, and that seemed worth writing down so it wouldn't be lost. He wrote it down. His son found it. That's how it usually works, with the things worth keeping.